So I want to just thank everybody for coming. There'll probably be a few people wandering in. They're still parking. But thank you all for coming today. This is something that we were really pushed by the board of the Kiowa Island Conservancy to help with getting more native plants on the island and in the Kiowa River watershed. So as an organization, we measure, manage, improve, and advocate for the ecological health of Kiowa Island and its environs. And we do this in four ways. We do it through ecological health, which is a lot of our monitoring and research. We do preservation and stewardship, which is a lot of our land preservation, which is really the core of our organization. We preserve land in perpetuity in its natural state. And then we do restoration and enhancement. So once we have the properties under preservation, what can we do to better enhance the land? And so that's where a lot of our native plant initiatives come into play and nature-based solutions. And then we do public affairs, communications, and education. So this event is really a good tie-in between our restoration and enhancement and our PACE committee, which is our outreach and education committee. So the whole reason we started this training program is to just make it a little bit easier for residents to use native plants. We really encourage people to use native plants in all of their landscaping, but we realize there's some challenges that people face. They may not have the knowledge. There may not be an availability of some of the native plants, and so one of our goals is to try to make these gaps and these difficulties a little bit easier for homeowners and residents. And we're also trying to help with a contractor series. So the first 3 training series that we're doing are based more towards residents and property owners. And then at the end of the year, we're going to really start working on more of a contractor-specific training for landscape professionals. Starting from last year, just our native plant initiatives, we sold 4,600 plants last year. We installed 3,600 plants. We donated 130 plants, and we created a lot of different templates and designs that hopefully you saw in the back of the room and as you entered. These can all be found, for the most part, in our native plant guide for Kiowa, Seabrook, and Johns Island. This is something that we worked with the Seabrook Island Green Space Conservancy on. There's a lot of different examples of plants that you can use, native plants in your landscape, and then you can find those templates. And so we worked with a landscape architect to create the templates, and this is something that we're going to constantly update. And so here's an example. Hopefully you saw this in the back, but this is a coastal pollinator garden, so it's a good way to get inspiration. You could take this design and put it into your yard, or you could use these plants as an example of how you can plant with natives in your yard. We're working on updating our native plant guide to include more salt-tolerant plants. We realize that with the increasing of storm surge and high tides, a lot of people are experiencing saltwater inundation in their yards, especially along the salt marsh. So this is something we adopted from Clemson Extension. A lot of their salt marsh plants that they recommend, we just illustrated it, and hope this will be incorporated so you can have examples of what you can use in your yard if you live along the salt marsh or near the salt marsh. Our native plant sale that we did last year with the Seabrook Island Green Space Conservancy, that was our first attempt at creating the pre-sale templates. And so within 1 week, we sold 93 templates for 4,600 plants. And we're going to do that again this year. So we're hopefully going to release those templates soon. And that'll be on May 18th this year. This is an example of the template that we created last year. We did 1 shade template and 1 sun template. And so we're going to introduce a new template this year. And Karen Madoff, who's here, she actually designed these. And then my coworker, Lee, animated them and made them look like this. So it'll be a similar style. It'll be at Night Heron Park this year. We need a little bit more space, so Freshfields was a little limited on their parking. So we hope that this will be a little bit smoother in the process, and we hope that we'll sell a lot more plants this year as well. And then just some upcoming events. We have this training series will continue April 10th. We're going to do the next series at a HOA on Kiowa Island, and there we're going to enhance their common space. And so we will have Jennifer Weaver of Clemson Extension, who's a designer and a horticultural agent, and she will help take some of the templates that we've created and show you how you can incorporate those into your landscape. Because we know that these templates won't fit exactly in everyone's yard or their property. So we want to be able to, adopt some of these templates to a space that really works for you. And then May 29th, we hope to do an installation at Seabrook Island at their tennis court or racquetball court installation. So we're working actively on that. We're going to do a site visit today to look for a space that we can do that. We're hopeful that that will be a hands-on experience where we'll actually go out and install the garden ourselves. And then again, the contractor training is something that we're really working on. We want to have contractors really help us with that. So landscape professionals in the industry helping shape that training, because we know that there are challenges that they face that are different from what homeowners face. And so we want to have resources available for them. We know that there's a demand for homeowners to have landscape professionals that are knowledgeable about native plants and can install and maintain them in their yards. So I want to thank everybody. Before I start, I want to get a show of hands for how many of you, raise your hands if you install native plants in your landscape. So almost everybody. Okay, and raise your hand if you have a landscaper or landscape professional that either maintains part of the year or most of the year. So a good amount also. So that, that's why we're trying to really help educate homeowners and landscape professionals. We know that it's a demand, but there's a little bit of a lack of knowledge, we think, and we hope that this training series will really help with that. I want to thank the Kiowa Conservancy staff for setting all this up and helping with the registration, the Seabrook Island Green Space Conservancy for co-sponsoring this, the town of Kiowa Island, thank you for having this venue. They also have a great resource online for their Grow Native initiative. They have a native plant database that I encourage you to check out. We also reference their database in our native plant guide if you want to go on there and look at it. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Christopher Burt is the Urban Horticultural Extension Agent for Berkeley, Charleston, and Dorchester counties. He works with a broad range of clients, including nurseries, landscapers, and homeowners to help with their landscaping and garden needs. Christopher also coordinates and teaches the Master Gardener program. So he's going to talk about site assessment and plant selection.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. All right, so thank you all for having me. Of course, thank you to the Kiowa Conservancy for putting this together. Native plants is one of those areas that oftentimes there's a lot of misunderstanding. And so I kind of want to clear up as much as possible and obviously leave some time for questions. But the first thing we really need to discuss is the concept of native plants. Hopefully everyone really understands what a native plant is, since we're all here talking about it. But I also want to get a little bit more in detail exactly what we're talking about. Essentially, these are plants that were here long before people were. The problem is we don't always have the historical data to prove a lot of these, and so some of these can be a little bit up for debate. Oftentimes there were people before the Europeans, and they moved plants too. And so we have to kind of understand that some of these plants move not only with people, but also with animals and other systems. But for the most part, this is our best understanding. Generally, we also try to utilize a lot of our historical paleobotany to try to understand, okay, was this actually here? Problem is, when we talk about native plants, we also have to understand that there are some cultivations happening with this. One of my favorite areas of debate, of course, is the concept of nativar. And if the South Carolina Native Plant Society was here, they would slap my wrist for using that term. But nativar just means it's a native cultivar. One of the things that we're starting to see an emergence of is the utilization of native plants into kind of more commercialized landscapes. And one of the ways that we're doing this is by taking wild type native plants and we're tweaking them, we're breeding them, we're trying to create plants that are much more suitable really for kind of that more contained landscape. The reason why this can be up for debate is there are some issues surrounding this, obviously, because of the relation with wildlife, which is the entire reason why we're planting these in the first place. But the good news is this is a good gateway for the average homeowner, for the average person to really get to know some of these native plants because these are much more accessible than some of our wild type plants. Of course, there are some hybrids. Some are natural, some are not. So just be aware of that. Oftentimes when we're hybridizing native plants, we're trying to, again, create a little bit of an improved quality to these plants. Generally, though, we're still looking for certain aspects as far as their benefit to wildlife. Because right off the bat, if we're not discussing how it benefits wildlife, in reality, we probably shouldn't be discussing this at all. And so we want to make sure, because the relationship with the wildlife that is native here is very important, we always want to look at the plants and see, does it bloom at the right time? So it has to bloom when the wild type does. If it blooms at a completely different time, it's not benefiting the wildlife it's supposed to. The flowers need to be single flowers. Double flowers are a big no-no. The reason why is we've bred that flower to not produce the proper pollen in the reproductive parts. Instead, we want more petals. So it's not as enjoyable for the actual pollinators. And of course, the foliage. One of the things I emphasize is be okay with some damage to your foliage because you're feeding insects, you're feeding wildlife. If that foliage is the wrong color, then those insects and wildlife cannot or will not consume it. And so when that happens, again, we're still losing that benefit of planting native. So standard green leaves, single flowers, and of course blooming at the right time. You follow those 3 rules for the most part, whether it's a cultivar or not, I think you are sufficient. I always have to explain that one first, mostly because it gets a little bit complicated. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated because I have to discuss what an actual native plant means. So, unfortunately, plants do not follow political boundaries. They don't look at the border of South Carolina and say, all right, I'm only going to live in South Carolina. We have to then discuss what's known as ecoregions. If you are not familiar with ecoregions, this is a very, very deep rabbit hole you can go down. But this gives you the idea of how we really define native plants. And when I discuss native plants, I am only going to focus on plants today that are native to coastal South Carolina. I tend to stop at level 3. You can get into level 4 and even sometimes a little bit deeper where you're talking about individual county populations. For me, as long as we know kind of the generalized range, this kind of gives you an idea of what we're looking for. If you want to look into your ecoregion, go to the EPA website. The EPA is the one who puts all this on. And of course, you can look at the state of South Carolina and see that we have 5 distinct ecoregions. And so when we say it's native to South Carolina, we have to be very specific. And then, of course, when you start getting even deeper than that, as you can see, where I'm standing now is a different ecoregion than Berkeley and Dorchester counties. And so you have to understand it can change just county by county. And that's where we kind of want to understand a little bit more about exactly where this is from. Obviously, I generally focus mostly on the coastal plain because that's where my area of coverage is. But that's also when I discuss natives, I'm focusing on what plants are native to the coastal plain of South Carolina. So keep that in mind. Again, I have to emphasize that because when we talk about natives, we're also going to hear a lot of conversation around plants that are native-ish or native adjacent. This means that they're native to Georgia or Florida or North Carolina. Oftentimes you're going to see plants missing that you're thinking, hey, why didn't he include the oak leaf hydrangea? And I have to explain because it's not native to the coastal plain of South Carolina. It's native to the coastal plain of Georgia, Florida, and of course, Alabama. And so you have to understand, oftentimes we'll see plants that are considered native, but they're not quite exactly what I'm referring to. But again, they're all still going to have that same benefit. All right, my tangent is off. We'll focus now on how to select them. Why are they important? First off, we're building, which means that all the land that you and I own now is, of course, not being wild habitat for our native wildlife. If we lose our native wildlife, guess what? We will cease to exist because native wildlife and us is a very important interaction. Of course, that interaction starts with your plants and starts with your soil. And so we plant native plants in order to make sure that connection stays. Also, why are we planting them? They're better adapted. Right off the bat, Lowcountry South Carolina is not an easy place to grow. Whether you're human or not, can be kind of harsh, especially in the heat of the summer, especially with saltwater flooding, especially with all the wildlife coming and nibbling. We want to make sure we have plants that are adapted to this area. Of course, not only adapted to this area, but serve a benefit for the area as far as soil and water conservation, as far as wildlife conservation, and things like that. The biggest thing also, and in reality is something that I always emphasize, is if you plant native, guess what you will never plant? Invasive species. So keep that in mind, because invasive species and even non-native species are not supporting wildlife. They may have some benefit, but it's always going to be much more minuscule compared to our native plants. Again, there is a reason why we discuss it at all. But the biggest thing is we avoid this. Everyone familiar with the Bradford pear? The Bradford pear was bought and sold as a sterile, perfect tree. I mean, they have an excellent shape. They bloom every year, few diseases or pests. And guess what happened? They didn't turn out to be sterile. And so, as with a lot of the plants that humans introduce on purpose, oftentimes they get out of hand fairly quickly. Generally, when I'm talking about native plants, the idea is we want to avoid this eventually happening. Whereas some plants we know have been around for several hundred years, the chances of a Camellia japonica becoming invasive are pretty slim. Problem is not every landscape's planting only that. Now we're planting ligustrums, we're planting Bradford pears, we're planting things that unfortunately in 10, 15 years are going to turn out to be a lot more problematic than we want. And so if we plant natives, we always avoid this. And again, why are invasives a bad thing? This is because they're basically choking out everything else, creating a monoculture. And of course, if you know what that is behind me, you can see that throughout the upstate of South Carolina and really throughout most of the eastern seaboard. That is kudzu. Kudzu just covers everything. It looks fairly surreal when you see it. It can grow up to 60 feet in a year. This is something that humans planted on purpose. And so keep that in mind, and unfortunately can be very devastating to an ecosystem because all those trees are now dead. Now, when we're talking about planting with natives, the first thing we have to do is site selection. So I'm going to really emphasize that. We'll try to go through that as quick as possible. It may seem a little basic, but we have to start off on the same page before we start talking about the actual plants. If we don't understand how to analyze your site, we can't then discuss what to plant. We want to take into account the native habitats and ranges of these plants themselves. There's a reason why every store, even Lowe's and Home Depot, sell Echinacea. It's because its native range is fairly extensive. When we start talking about plants with a very small native range, it becomes a little bit harder. And so we always want to take into account that native range so we understand exactly how adaptable it truly is. And of course, select plants based on your needs. If you don't have a shady area, I'm probably not going to plant something like partridge berry, which you see pictured here, as a good ground cover. And so you want to make sure you are fitting the needs of your plants. If you just want to keep it mulched, then you probably don't put this in. But if you want a nice ground cover that supports wildlife, that is an excellent choice. Now, these are going to be some of the basic principles that I emphasize. We're going to start off with choosing the right plant in the right place. Before we do that, we have to understand what that right place means. Then we have to make sure we're choosing plants that are suitable for the landscape. There are exceptions to every rule, of course, but oftentimes you'll see certain plants may become a little bit more wild than we prefer. And then, of course, preparing and establishing the soil, the big emphasis on that is, again, if you're selecting the right place, we're really just making sure that they're watered well and they're planted properly, which obviously we'll have a whole talk just on planting. And then, of course, always plan for diversity. I absolutely adore Pygnanthinum, which is your mountain mints. But if I planted my garden in only mountain mints, my garden's probably not going to be very beneficial to wildlife, which again is the entire concept that we're shooting for. So make sure you are planting for diversity. And then the big thing that I'm going to really emphasize on is planting in layers. In fact, whenever you think of a landscape, when you think of a wild area, you think of it in layers. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more. So, Why right plant, right place? First off, if you cannot fit the landscape to the plant. If I have a sunny, dry area, I'm probably not going to plant shade-loving wetland plants. They're probably not going to like it very much, no matter how much I try to water. And so you want to make sure that you're selecting the plants that are going to be best adapted to your area. And of course, this reduces long-term problems, is really the big emphasis. So, site analysis. There's going to be an above ground and a below ground portion of this. Just means that we need to discuss what's above and what's below. If you understand how to analyze those two things, generally we know exactly what we're looking for when we're selecting the plants. Hardiness zone. You're going to hear a lot of conversation about this from various institutions around landscaping. When we're dealing with native plants, this is completely meaningless, because what I'm focused on is ecoregions, and I'm focused on true native plants. If it's native here, I'm not worried about if it can tolerate our temperatures, because guess what? It's adapted to our area. But we do want to focus on microclimates specifically. And what does that mean? That means when I create a landscape, when I plant trees, when I put water features, when I put pavers, this is going to change the climate. If you're the microclimate. If you live downtown Charleston, I've been in many courtyards where they have true tropical plants growing. Because guess what? They have buildings on all sides which provide this heat island effect. And so none of their plants are ever going to be bothered by cold. And so microclimates have to be taken into account. And again, as you landscape, you'll notice certain things will start to prefer one way or the other. And so always kind of keep this in mind. It is going to affect not only the cold and heat tolerance, but also the shade tolerance. All right, below and above ground. Above ground, sun. This is probably the biggest thing I encourage you to take away, is getting to know where your sun lands in your yard. Because right off the bat, the first question I always ask when it comes to landscaping needs is, how much sun do you have? Wind, salt, power lines, and of course existing trees all come into play as well. Sun versus shade. The big emphasis is, what kind of sun are we getting? If it's full sun throughout the day, that means we're getting 12 plus hours of sunlight from morning till dawn, or morning till night, which means we need to make sure we have plants that are adapted to that. One of the big emphasis I always focus on when it comes to native plants is think about it where it's naturally found. If it's growing in the dunes along the beach, it's probably going to be okay in full sun. If it's growing underneath lots of grand oaks, it's probably not going to like full sun. And so kind of get to know where this is naturally going to grow. This will help guide us a little bit more on this. But get to know how much sun you're going to get. And if it's, of course, filtered sunlight, morning or afternoon, afternoon, of course, is much harsher. And, of course, understand the different intensities as well as proximity to other plants. Wind, the big emphasis for this is, if we are growing plants, say I am planting a understory plant that in a shaded area, but it's exposed to the wind, do you think an understory plant that is protected by all these big trees is going to like a lot of wind? This oftentimes can make things less hardy, especially in the winter. It can dry plants out quicker. Wind is a factor to take into account. If you're planting something in the middle of an open field, this means you're going to have a lot more wind effects than if you plant it next to buildings, next to other trees. So again, wind is something to take into account. Salt, we've heard this several times, but if you live along the coast, especially close to the water, salt is something to keep in mind. I always encourage focusing on plants that are salt tolerant. And if you're selecting native plants that are best grown along the coast, generally this is something that comes with the territory. And of course, existing trees. If I am growing underneath existing trees, again, those trees take precedence. And so you need to not only respect them and try to plant accordingly, but you also need to keep in mind that it's not just the shade, it's going to be a whole lot of other things. The leaf fall. If you're planting underneath something like, say, a Magnolia grandiflora, which is a southern magnolia, That can stunt plants because as those leaves break down, they release an allelopathic chemical that helps to prevent competition with their roots. Live oaks, they drop their leaves twice a year. That's a lot of leaf matter covering that ground. So you want to select plants that can tolerate it. And of course, you want to plant based on respect for that tree, because that tree, again, takes precedence. And then unfortunately, power lines do as well, because while power lines are not natural, they do have a jurisdiction that we cannot control. This is a federal jurisdiction, and it encompasses 25 feet around those power lines. If you have a plant growing within that 25 feet, I don't care how much you complain, does not matter. That is federal jurisdiction. The power line companies have control of that. Plant accordingly. Do not plant anything that's going to get too tall, otherwise we're topping it and having a very unfortunate looking plant. All right, below ground. The biggest emphasis on below ground is going to be soil. Soil, soil, soil. And I repeat that only to emphasize how important it is. Soil pH, of course, is a chemical analysis of the available hydrogen ions, just is going to be in relation to how well plants can uptake nutrients. Again, if you know your soil pH and you know generally what plants that you're selecting prefer, as long as they coincide, we're okay. This is not something we can change very quickly or easily, and generally is not something I encourage changing. Again, select plants that are going to be best adapted. We naturally have an acidic pH here. Select plants that like it. If you are selecting plants that are naturally found in a limestone glade, they might not like it when your pH is 5. So keep all of these things in mind. Soil texture and drainage. Along the coast, we got lots of sand. That drainage means we're going to have very sandy soils, means generally we have good drainage. Of course, there's other things that can come into play, but for the most part, we should have fairly decent drainage. Problem is you have to have it drain somewhere. And for the most part, we have a very high water table. But you can't always do the jar test to make sure. The further inland you get, the more clay you're going to get. Even along the coast, you're going to see variations just based on how that soil originated. And so it's always good to check. If you don't know what the jar test is, Clemson's got a good fact sheet on it, but it is just you're putting soil in a jar, adding water, shaking it up, and seeing how it filters out. Soil is made up of mineral components, sand, silt, or clay. Sand, of course, is the largest, silt is the middle, and of course clay is the smallest particle. Clay tends to have very small pore spaces, reducing how much water infiltration you'll have and reducing how much airflow. You need plants that can tolerate that. Sandy soils, of course, is quite the opposite. You have very large pore space, but almost no water holding capacity. You need plants that can tolerate being drier between rainfall events, because ideally we shouldn't have to irrigate supplementally when we're using native plants. Keep in mind your subsoil. If you dig 8 to 10 inches down, usually you'll start to see what that subsoil looks like. Oftentimes it's a pretty dense clay. If you're really close to the water, you'll just hit water. And so keep that in mind as well, because that will come into play with your soil depth. The closer you are to the coast, the closer you are to the water, the larger material you're going to plant. You want to plant things that can tolerate those high water tables and, of course, specifically that salt inundation from flooding. Again, high water tables can be fairly significant and oftentimes very common in the coastal plain of South Carolina. Last thing, before you ever go out and plant, especially if you're planting lots of material or you don't know the area specifically, please do call before you dig. 811 is I believe, free service. But this is just to make sure you're not going and cutting any power lines or anything like that. Okay, now that we understand how to analyze our site, let's select plants. Anyone recognize the plant on the screen? Yes, a Venus flytrap, one of the most best known carnivorous plants. If you did not know, it is native to 2 places in the world, the coastal plain of South Carolina and the coastal plain of North Carolina. And so I always use this as an example because this one's got a very specific site preference. It needs fairly wet soils, very poor nutrient soils, and fairly acidic soils, kind of a bog environment. I'm probably not putting this in my front yard next to my azaleas. But I use that as a real big emphasis on right plant, right place. Don't try to change the environment for the plant. Change the plant for the environment. And of course, consider habitat and of course, growth habit as well. Making sure we understand how big is it going to get. Because I'm not planting full-grown plants. I'm planting small 4-inch, 1-gallon plants. They're going to grow, hopefully. And if they do, how big are they going to get? And keep that in mind when you're planting in relation to not only other plants, but the buildings you're planting them near as well. And of course, not all plants are suitable for the landscape, though I don't say this to say goldenrod is not suitable. There are goldenrods I'd probably avoid. But goldenrod can get a little bit crazy if you allow it to. Oftentimes, most of our natives perennials can. Just be aware of this. If you've got an area where you need the plant to stay in its 4 corners or its 4 sides, then unfortunately, you need to select a plant that can do that. And so making sure that you are, of course, selecting that. And then, of course, preparing the soil. The biggest thing is if we've done the site analysis, we're not going out and buying a whole lot of amendments. We're selecting plants that are best suited for our soils. And so, instead of going out and buying a whole lot, what I'm doing is selecting the right plants. Now, once I plant, the biggest thing you have to do, unfortunately, even if I'm planting natives, is water. Because you are taking a plant from its preferred habitat and putting it in a new one. Those plant roots need time to grow. And you never want it to dry out completely. And so you do need to make sure you are monitoring water. Outside of that, it's really just plant, water, and leave. That's kind of the nice thing about native plants. And of course, mulching. I do encourage mulching. And of course, eventual size matters. If you are planting a large tree, do not plant it close to your house. I have a loblolly pine that someone accidentally let grow next to my house. It's within 2 feet of my house. The problem is now that it is a 3-foot caliper tree, I'm probably not removing it cheaply. And so keep in mind, it's a lot easier to move it when it's small, and it's a lot easier to remove when it's small. So do keep all these things in mind. And what size should I buy? If you are like some and you prefer to plant established large plants, keep in mind that these are going to be harder to take. These are going to be harder to plant, they're going to be more expensive, and the chance of survival goes down significantly with size increase. I would always encourage, get to know what sizes are available, and try to select a size that you're comfortable with planting yourself, but also a size that you're okay with as far as how long you have to wait for it to grow. And remember, when we're planting these native plants, oftentimes you're not necessarily just planting for yourself. These are plants I want to be there for a long period of time, and so plant them small is perfectly fine. Purchasing plant material depends on where you're getting it from, but local plant sales are always an excellent choice. So be very careful with certain plants. That Venus flytrap I mentioned, that is federally endangered. And so if you happen to go to a stall at the side of the road and they're selling Venus flytraps and they don't really know where they got them from, be aware. So make sure you are selecting or buying plants from fairly reputable vendors. For the most part, though, plants that are grown in someone's backyard are perfect. We just want to make sure we're not getting plants that have been harvested, I guess, not necessarily illegally, but some of them are. So kind of keep that in mind. So, selecting quality stock, of course, inspect the material, make sure it looks healthy, looks good, make sure it's properly identified. If I see on the side of the pot that it is Cherokee sedge and it's actually muley grass, that might be a red flag that I should be a little bit more aware of what plants I'm selecting at this nursery or establishment. So make sure you're identifying the plants fairly well yourself. And of course, selecting high quality material is going to give us the best chance for survival long term. All right, a couple of considerations to include when you're selecting this material. Just keep in mind, we want to make sure it looks good and it was cared for properly. And of course, inspect for any disease or insects prior to planting. Insects are not always a bad thing, but when I'm putting it in the ground, I want as little things damaging it as possible, mostly because it's already stressful being transplanted. And so if you happen to be buying a plant that is already covered in its caterpillars that you're buying it as a host plant for, be aware that that might cause some problems in that transplanting stage. And of course, look for any damage, injury, things like that. And of course, overall shape. Okay. I won't get too much into how to plant. Obviously, that will be a whole discussion going forward. I want to get to the plants. I do want to emphasize, do mulch, please. If you are not mulching, unfortunately, bare soil can be a problem. And avoid volcano mulching. And of course, I encourage using organic mulches specifically. You do not have to use pine straw. I always get the comment, I hate pine straw. That's fine. Use leaves. Use wood chips. But use something to cover that soil. It keeps the plants happier. It reduces weeds. And generally, it creates a very healthy environment. It's also good for the wildlife themselves. I do recommend avoiding rocks, fabrics, any inorganic materials, as those are less beneficial all around. Okay. How to apply, care, water is key, and then pruning is very limited. All right, plant selections. That was kind of half of it. We need to make sure we understand our spot and we're planting accordingly. Now let's get to the fun part where we actually talk about the plants themselves. All right. This is where I'm going to emphasize planting in layers. You want to keep this in mind because this is where they're naturally found in the wild. And so when we talk about understory layers, when we talk about shrub layers, when we talk about canopy layers, what are they doing in the ecosystem as a whole? The canopy layer, of course, this is going to be your large trees. The good thing is, this is the area I think that if we only plant native trees, we can really improve a lot of the significant issues that we have as far as ecological and landscaping development. Trees is where I always emphasize starting because we have so many awesome native trees. If you look around, most of the trees you see planted in most areas are native already. Whether it's the live oaks or the cabbage palms or the red maples or any of those, as long as we avoid selecting these non-native, potentially invasive plants like the Bradford pear, this is where we can really kind of focus a lot of our efforts, because when we talk about importance to wildlife, right there, that picture is one of the most important trees to wildlife, period. So I'm going to go through a couple of the trees. I'm going to be a little bit quick with this only. I've got some time, but I'm still going to, we've got a lot more to cover. So I want to make sure I'm as quick with this as possible. But I'm going to go through these. I do emphasize this is just some, not all. If we went through all our native species, we would be here for several hours. And I probably would still miss a lot. And so we're going to kind of focus on some of the prime targets. Acer rubrum, also known as red maple. This is an excellent native tree. There's actually several native, well, I say several. There are a couple native maples. Red maple is the most popular. Of course, red maple is a very important native tree. It's also, if you're familiar with what is currently happening with invasive species, is the primary target for the Asian longhorned beetle. And so keep that in mind. This is also not a street tree. I don't know who told landscapers it was, but it is not a street tree. I see it planted in front yards that are, 100 square feet. I see it planted along roadways. This tree does not like to have disturbed roots. It doesn't mind competition from other trees. But if it's getting constant walking, or anything like that, if it has a damaged root system, it is already going to be at a disadvantage. This tree needs some room to grow. River birch, kind of the same concept, though it can tolerate a lot more. This tree gets big. I mean, we're talking about a 50-foot tree. Does like wet soils, as the name implies. It can tolerate some drier climates, but this is much more of a bottomland tree. It tends to like it a little bit damper. Of course, this is our birch. Whereas you've got the paper birches and other birches up north, this is kind of our selection for it. It's got a pretty broad range to it. Very adaptable tree. And very important for wildlife. Common persimmon. One of the questions I often get, what are native fruits I can grow? This should be at the top of every list when we talk about native fruits. Because guess what? Native persimmon does extraordinarily well. I will warn you, it does like to spread. The wildlife absolutely adores the fruit. And if you like picking the fruit right off the tree, this might not be the tree for you. Only because those fruits basically need to fall off before they're edible. It has a ability to have, it's called, what is the word for it? It makes it very kind of bitter, almost chalky feeling. If you try to eat it too soon off the tree, unfortunately, astringent, thank you. I don't know why I blanked on the word. This is a dioecious species. If you select it, you do need to make sure you are selecting a female for the fruit. If you're just selecting the male, that's fine. Just keep in mind you won't get many fruits from it. American beech, you see this a lot less here along the coast, though it is still a native on the coastal plain. Very important grand tree. Though if I'm selecting a tree in this family, the Fagaceae family, I'm probably going to go with some of our better selections, the oaks. Everyone's most despised tree, sweet gums. This is an incredibly important native tree. Despite everyone's insistence that it's the worst thing ever to be invented, it is actually very important. It is a little weedy, I will say that, and it's kind of, it can produce a lot of debris. But an established sweet gum is an excellent addition to any yard, provides awesome shade and food for wildlife, and for the most part has few to no issues. Just keep in mind it drops those gum balls, and they're always on the ground. One of my favorite trees, tulip. This is one of the trees I use as an example. We need to learn our Latin names because you hear tulip tree, about 3 different species can come to mind. Liriodendron tulipifera, the only member of the magnolia family that is not a magnolia. This is, of course, an excellent tree, though the key is you need lots of sun. It does not like any shade. It will struggle a bit in shade. Very important for wildlife. They all are, really. Magnolias, we actually have a couple other native species. The 2 I always emphasize, the sweet bay, a little bit more of that bottomland tree, and then you've got your Magnolia grandiflora, your southern magnolia. This is the tree I emphasize planting in every yard because, man, I cannot tell you how many birds nest in this. It provides that dense canopy, lots of leaf litter on the ground, very important for wildlife. Though if you don't like messy trees, this one's going to be a bit tough. Black gums, a very underutilized native tree, not to be confused with the sweet gum. This is, of course, a black gum. This is one that you'll often see in wet areas growing alongside the bald cypress. Pines. Now, one thing I will emphasize, loblolly pine is native. That does not mean we have to only have loblolly pines. We have a couple other native species. There's actually, I think, 7. We'll usually see 1 or 2 bought and sold. The big one that we probably should be focusing on encouraging, of course, is the longleaf pine. Everyone familiar with the longleaf pine? This is where we get our longleaf pine straw. This is a very important native tree. This tree has a very distinct relationship with fire, and the longleaf pine savannas are some of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world. These are in decline, as well as the cockaded woodpecker that needs them. And so this is a big one to focus on encouraging. Obviously, I don't know if I have enough room for a 120-foot tree in my backyard, but this is one of those trees that we should be encouraging more and more people to plant. Sycamore. Now, as much as I absolutely adore sycamore, this is a very fast-growing, large tree. If you do not have space for it, I would caution your planting of it. This tree gets big, and it gets big fast. But man, is it pretty, especially in the wintertime when all the leaves are off and it's got that really stark white bark. It's absolutely gorgeous. Very important native tree. Though remember, there are several different species of this. Platanus occidentalis is the native species. And then oaks. I could probably just spend another hour just talking about these. These are some of the most important. But this is the Quercus genus. I won't go through all the species. We have about 28 native ones here. And again, I cannot emphasize how important they are. Probably the big one most people are familiar with, of course, is the live oak. But we also have white oak. Well, they're divided up into two groups. You have red oaks and white oaks. And of course, the most common one being live oaks. These are going to support a tremendous amount of wildlife. All oaks really will. And then when it comes to the most important genera, this is number 3 on our native plant list. Salix. We oftentimes don't think about it. You have Quercus, Prunus, and then Salix. This is the willows. We actually have 2 native species of willows. You have the black willow and the Carolina willow. Black willow is a very important canopy tree. A little bit harder to find, but it's a great one to incorporate. You'll oftentimes see this growing in wet areas. As you probably guessed, willows like it wet. Basswood or linden tree. This is another one I don't see nearly as much, but it is a very attractive tree. And of course, a larval plant for the red spotted purple. Arguably my favorite tree of all time, or my favorite plant of all time, Taxodium distichum. This is the bald cypress. This is our tree for the swamps. This is our answer to the redwoods and the sequoias. This is a absolutely gorgeous tree. They don't get as big as their cousins out west, but this is an awesome, awesome tree. Very important for a lot of wildlife to grow. Elms. Keep in mind, there are more elms than just the Chinese elm. Again, this is where I emphasize why if we can select native trees only, that would, again, encourage a lot of those landscapes that we see right off the bat. We're improving them significantly. Chinese elm, there's some invasive potential with it. Instead, planting something like the American elm, the winged elm, even the slippery elm, all 3 native. One thing I do need to mention, though, there are diseases. And one of the big reasons why I did not mention chestnuts, which are really native to the upstate, is because of chestnut blight. American elm does have the potential to get Dutch elm disease. That being said, doesn't seem like it's really made it this far south. And so there are still quite a few large American elms scattered throughout the low country. All right, understory layer. This is where most people start selecting their plants because the canopy's already planted. I've got a, 100 or 40-foot, 50-foot live oak. I'm probably not worried about planting anything near it. But what I can do is plant some of the understories. And again, number 2 on the list of I want to plant native fruits, pawpaws. Everyone been down on the pawpaw patch? Awesome native fruit. In reality, one of those trees that if you don't even want a fruit tree, I would still encourage planting it because it is a larval host plant for the zebra swallowtail. Lots of mammals will enjoy the fruit, and in reality, it's just a very fascinating plant. Mostly because the primary consumers of the fruits and the primary pollinators are kind of unknown, so it's fascinating in that aspect, and it's a really cool, again, understory plant that can tolerate a whole lot of situations. One of my all-time favorite understory trees is the red buckeye. Definitely a much better selection than any of the other buckeyes throughout the other parts of the country. This one, of course, is one of we have 3 native buckeyes. The red one, of course, is going to have the red flowers that come out. Awesome, awesome tree, especially for those hummingbirds. Serviceberries, another one very important. Again, does produce some fruits that have been used both for their edibility and or medicinal properties. In reality, this is one I'm planting for the birds. Sea myrtles, this is one you're probably familiar with, Baccharis. It's growing all over the coast. It's very weedy, grows fast, but it is an awesome, awesome tree to incorporate. If you have it popping up in your yard, let it grow. This is one of my favorites because I don't have to go out and buy it. I usually already have it. American hornbeam, this one gets a little bit bigger, but still a good one. This is also known as musclewood, and if you've ever seen them growing, they're much smaller than the canopy trees around them, but they have wood that looks like mussels. It's really cool. Redbuds, as I will emphasize with the dogwood as well. There are native trees that unfortunately are in decline. Redbud's in that category. It is susceptible to certain wilts, but still a very important native tree. And as you have probably seen in the past couple weeks, it is quite a sight to behold. Fringe tree, this one I'm seeing popularity, it's growing in popularity, and I'm seeing more and more nurseries carrying this, which is exciting. But a very important or very excellent native tree. Can tolerate a lot more sun and tends to do very well kind of in that open climate. And then dogwoods, Cornus Florida. This is one of those trees that unfortunately we're seeing a lot fewer ones because of disease. We get several different diseases here, specifically 2 different anthracnose diseases. And as we see this one decline, unfortunately, there's not much filling its hole. And so, luckily though, this is still a tree that we have, and it's still a tree you can plant. Just be aware of some problems along with it. And probably the best misunderstood group of plants, hawthorns, not to be confused with Indian hawthorns, which is Raphiolepis. These are Crataegus species. There's several different ones. This is a very important group of plants that most, even botanists, don't really know much about. It's often overlooked, mostly because they kind of look very similar to each other, to different species, but they're a fascinating group of plants. Hollies. This is a fairly large group of plants, large genera. Ilex. The 2 most common understory trees we'll usually see are going to be like Ilex cassine, which is the Dahoon, and Ilex opaca, which is the American holly. Both of these are excellent, kind of more standard trees, so we can put these out a little bit more open areas. But I'll talk about some of the ones that do well in those shaded areas as well. Eastern red cedar, we've actually got, this is really our big conifer here outside of the bald cypress. This is a very awesome tree, and when we talk about salt tolerance, this one's got a lot better salt tolerance than I think a lot of the ones we could select from. Red mulberries, this one again, it gets big, it can get big fast, but it's still often considered a understory tree. This is one though, the fruits are absolutely delicious. They're hard to get to because the birds usually get to them first. But it's a good one to include because of that. And then that very important genus, Prunus. This is going to be your cherry laurels, your American plums, your wild cherries, your Chickasaw plums. While everyone wants to grow peaches, everyone wants to grow plums, these are much more significant. And these are much easier to grow. They're generally considered thicket species, at least the American plum is and the wild cherries. These are ones that like growing next to each other, and they don't mind a little bit of competition. But they're very important for the bird species, especially overwintering. And of course, the fruits are edible, except for the cherry laurel. The cherry laurel is very toxic. And the cherry laurel is also evergreen and very weedy. So if you happen to have it growing in your yard, great, just let it grow. It's important for wildlife, but it does tend to spread. And then the Carolina willow is that other willow I mentioned. It's a much smaller species. Sassafras, like root beer, what they used to make root beer out of. Thankfully, they don't anymore because sassafras is, of course, in decline for a variety of reasons. Excellent tree to incorporate, though I don't see it nearly as much this close to the coast. You usually see it much more, kind of more in the Midlands. All right, shrub layer. Make sure I don't go over time. Everyone familiar with that plant? Might be blooming now, I'm not sure. Shrub layer. One of my favorites, Calicarpa americana, which is the beauty berry. If you've never grown a native plant in your life, this is an excellent one to start with. Edible fruits, easy to grow, tolerates abuse. You put it just about anywhere in your landscape, sun or shade, though it does like more sun. This is an easy one to grow and a very important one for the wildlife. It's in the mint family, though it doesn't spread like plants in the mint family. It does have really cool looking flowers of those in the mint family. And of course those fruits, though we don't necessarily enjoy them nearly as much, the wildlife does. It's a good soft mast species. Buttonbush, this one's going to really need some wetter areas. Generally it's going to struggle in too dense of shade and too dry, but a very cool looking species when you see it out in the wild. Clethra or sweet pepper bush, though unfortunately you cannot use this as a pepper alternative. The fruits kind of look like peppercorns, that's why it's called sweet pepper bush. They don't taste very peppery at all, but an easy one to grow and an awesome one to grow if you've got some wetter areas. And of course, Fothergilla. This is a interesting one. It's not one I see grown very much, mostly because I think people struggle to get it established. Once established, though, this is a very tough species and a very important one to grow nonetheless. And then I mentioned those hollies. So I mentioned the two much larger ones. We have several understory holly or shrub hollies as well. Probably one you're all familiar with, inkberries, Ilex glabra. This is an excellent one. It's fairly salt tolerant, though probably not gonna if I have salt inundation, but it is very adaptable provided it's got some shade. Possum haw, this one's going to be much more of a wild looking shrub, gets much larger. Unfortunately, if you want a more formal landscape, it's probably not going to be my first choice, but it's still extremely important for the wildlife. And then the one that is probably the poster child for cultivar natives is the Yaupon holly. This is one we see all around, especially the dwarf cultivars. These are excellent to incorporate in landscapes because the flowers are very important for pollinators. And of course the fruits, if you have a female, is very important for birds and other mammals or in other wildlife. Virginia sweetspire. This is one I see it sold a lot more. It's becoming more and more popular. But I think deciduous shrubs, unfortunately, tend to turn people off a little bit. This is an excellent one to grow. I have it in both sun and shade. It does like it a little bit more moist, but it has really, really cool flowers in the when it blooms, and of course supports a myriad of wildlife. Wax myrtle. This is a very large shrub. This one can get up to 16 feet tall, 18 feet tall. It's a very important tree species or shrub species. Unfortunately, it is very weak wooded. This is one of those that grows very fast, and often I'll see it pruned into a tree type shape and it splits. So the best thing to do is let it grow kind of wild, fairly natural. It is dioecious like our hollies, so if you purchase one that is a male, the flowers are good for the wildlife, but if you want the berries to make wax, which is why it's called a wax myrtle, you would need a female with that. I know roses are often looked down upon, but we do have two native species of roses, Rosa carolina and Rosa palustris. Now, if you do not like wild roses, this one might not be a good choice because they spread. But these hips are very important as far as that soft mast goes. And when I keep using the word soft mast, this is an important food source for wildlife. But these do tend to get a little weedy. They sucker really easily. But if you've never tried to grow a rose, that's a good one to try. And then azaleas, there's too many to count, so I just made it all into one slide. Several native species of rhododendron. This is another group that we're seeing a lot more hybrids. They hybridize very easily. We're seeing a lot more cultivars. These are still excellent choices and definitely a good gateway for those native plant selections for landscapes. And of course, these are the ones blooming right now. We're starting to bloom. They're a little bit later than our indica types. All of these are going to be deciduous. If you see an evergreen azalea, it is not native. Then a couple of them real quick. Sweet. Again, most of these have at least some fragrance. It's kind of nice. Blooms early May. Atlanticum, the coastal azalea. Again, blooms in April. Canescence. That one's actually, I'm seeing, starting to bloom now. Oconee, this one does do well despite Oconee being in the name. Pinkster bloom, it's a good pink one. And of course the swamp azalea, one of the few azaleas that can tolerate being in wetter soils. Most azaleas do not like it wet. Blueberries. There are several native species of Vaccinium. I'm not going to go through them all. I want to mention the blueberry. Again, another good native fruit. Big thing about blueberries, these are not salt tolerant. Any blueberries, Vaccinium genus, is generally not salt tolerant. Azaleas can be a little bit more so. These are definitely not. And they're both in the same family. That's why I included them together. Sparkleberry, this is a good one for the wildlife. You're not eating the berries much. And then, of course, small viburnums, small leaf viburnums. There's actually, this is another excellent addition because it's a good replacement for a lot of your kind of more standard boxwoods and other non-native shrubs. Okay, want to mention a few native vines. State flower. Everyone know this one? If you see any yellow growing up in your Bradford pears, this is probably why. Because this is a good response to our invasives, is because this one's kind of weedy itself. But this is a really, really interesting species, also called Carolina jasmine, though it is not a jasmine. It is a jessamine. Very tolerant of just about everything. It's again why it's a state flower. Coral honeysuckle. If you are going to grow honeysuckle, I encourage you to plant coral honeysuckle, not only because it's much more attractive than the white, in my opinion, but also because it's a very important food source for our ruby-throated hummingbirds. Anytime you see long and red, that's probably important for hummingbirds. Crossvine, it's actually a very cool species. You don't see it nearly as much here, but I am seeing it more and more in nurseries, which is exciting. And probably a better selection, trumpet creeper. When we're talking about vines, keep in mind they have to grow on something. Both the trumpet creeper and the crossvine are fairly vigorous. And then if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned any hydrangeas yet, This is why. We only have one native species of hydrangea. And 10 years ago, I couldn't have even said that because this recently changed its genus. It used to be Decumeria barbara. Now it is officially Hydrangea barbara, making it our one and only native hydrangea species to the coastal plain of South Carolina. That being said, I'm fine with your native adjacents like your smooth hydrangea or your oak leaf. Again, wisteria is highly invasive and very problematic. What could be our answer to that? American wisteria. The only problem is it's nowhere near as vigorous. And then one of my favorites, passion flowers. Important food source for the Gulf fritillary caterpillar. You don't need many of these to have Gulf fritillaries, I'll say that. And I know, everyone's going to say this is a weed, but Virginia creeper is an awesome, awesome native vine. And I've got it growing along some dead trees, and I'll say it's the prettiest fall color you can ask for in the garden. And very important for wildlife. Pollinators, mammals, birds go crazy for the fruits. It's in the grape family, so it's got really cool grape-like fruits. And if you have poison ivy growing with it, that's fine. Just don't try to pull any of it. Not going to hurt anything. All right, herbaceous layer. I'll try to be quick with this so we can walk outside. How much more time do I have, Sean? I can keep going for hours. You got to be careful now.
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, perfect. All right, I can do 5 more minutes. All right, we'll be quick. Blue star, Amsonia. We have 2 native species, Amsonia ciliata and Amsonia tabernaemontana. There are other Amsonia species that are often grown, and we're seeing hybrids available as well. This is still a good species to grow. Very important for pollinators. Usually by the time we get to this point, we're talking about focusing exclusively on the flowers, adding in that color. By this point, our landscape is established. Now we're filling in the gaps. Milkweeds. We have 18 native species of milkweed. And I will say every one of them is going to be almost impossible to find. You go to any landscape nursery, big box store, guess what they're all selling? The tropical. It is better not to plant milkweed at all than to plant the tropical milkweed. So keep that in mind. There are plenty of milkweeds available. Climbing aster, one of my favorites. Any of the aster families, really, really fascinating plants. Blue mist flower. This is one I will warn you about. I absolutely adore this one. It is a beautiful flower, especially when it's growing in conjunction with your swamp sunflowers. But it is weedy, as is the swamp sunflower. So it will escape cultivation. Not it may, it will. Mine has went from a single plant to now covers an entire bed, though it is the prettiest bed when it's in bloom. Purple cone flower. This is my gateway plant for native plants. If you've never grown a native plant, start with this. Because purple cone flower is easy to grow, it's native, and of course, extremely, extremely important for wildlife. I can't tell you how many times I walked outside and see nice large bumblebees asleep on my purple coneflower. Joe Pye weed. Joe Pye weed is another interesting group because there's so many cool cultivars coming out that are much more compact and a lot easier to grow, which is an interesting development because this is a very important species, or genus really, and unfortunately tends to be overlooked because if it does get big, it gets a little bit wild. Gaillardia, oftentimes the one you see is always going to be the standard Gaillardia pucella. This is Gaillardia aestivalis. This is our native species. You see Gaillardia growing in the sand dunes, this is the one. This is one of the most drought tolerant plants you can find. Narrowleaf sunflower, this is one I'll warn you about. Angustifolia is very aggressive. though Helianthus is considered a keystone genus because all of the species within that are native in their areas are extremely important to the wildlife surrounding them. Rudbeckia, this one probably can go without emphasis, but such a cool group of plants. Brown-eyed Susan, black-eyed Susans. There's several other selections as well. One of the other groups, kind of along with the coneflower, the echinaceas that you'll see in almost every nursery. One of my favorites, just because of how cool they look, but goldenrods, these are not causing your allergies, though they do bloom at the same time as our native ragweed. But this pollen is very important for the pollinators. It cannot go with the wind. Stokes aster, this is a good evergreen. All the other asters, Symphyotrichums, awesome. I tend to get these too leggy in my opinion, but they're still an important fall bloomer. Ironweeds, be careful not to plant the non-native ironweeds. There's certain species that probably are not preferred, but still a very important one to grow. Cardinal flower, I always struggle with this one. I probably just don't have the right spot for it. But this is a good dense shade, moist area grower. I'll see this growing along string banks, and it's a cool one to see. False indigo, Baptisia. We do have several native species, and we have several native adjacent species, like your Baptisia australis. But we have, I think, Baptisia alba and Baptisia, the yellow one. I can't remember the species name off the top of my head. Thank you, whoever said it. St. John's wort, this is a really cool species, or genus, actually. It's about 25 species. I don't know why I don't see these more, but would encourage you to look more into St. John's wort. It's an awesome, awesome plant. Georgia calamint, or Georgia, Georgia calamint. This is a really interesting, kind of more shrubby perennial, but definitely does extremely well. I absolutely adore this one. And then I have to emphasize that Monarda is going to have one native species, but all species in this genus are going to be extremely beneficial to wildlife. It does spread. And then my all-time favorite genus, period, Pycnanthinum, mostly because this is such a cool group of plants. And when these are in full bloom, you cannot go by a flower and not see 100 different sweat bees, wasps, all these really cool native pollinators on them. And as my time expires, I will also mention sage. We have two native species of salvia in Low Country, South Carolina, Salvia lyrata and Salvia azurea. Azurea, of course, being the blue sage. I have to mention there's several species of hibiscus and hibiscus-related species that are awesome. Make sure you're selecting the one that's best suited for your area. This is a really good one, not only for wet areas, but also for salt areas as well. Phlox, there's several native species of phlox. Oftentimes you'll see these in nurseries as well. Larkspur delphiniums do have a native species, definitely worth looking into. Coreopsis, I love Coreopsis. I always find this is a good one to see growing in the side of the road. I always struggle to get this to grow in my yard, if I'm being very honest. Disease becomes kind of prevalent in your home garden. Blazing Star Liatris, it's a cool genus as well. This one's going to really like drier areas though, much rockier areas. Penstemons, another cool species as well. Columbines for your shadier gardens. And I want to mention a few native grasses, apologize. And again, I can keep going for days. I have to be careful. I'm not even going to get to the ferns and then the herbaceous layer. Indian grass is our state grass. Big blue stem. This is going to be a big grass. If you were thinking it's too big, you can always go with a little blue stem. Though it's a whole different genus, definitely a really cool one to grow. All your grasses are generally going to like sun. So keep that in mind. Fakahatchee grass, I'm seeing this more and more in nurseries. Switchgrass, this one I'm not seeing nearly as much as this one, or not Upland River Oats, which is a very cool one for wet shade areas, though it does spread. Sea oats, if you're ever wondering what the grass is on the dunes, it's your sea oats. And muley grass, of course, is the most common. Be aware, we're probably overplanting this. So we're seeing muley grass, mealybug starting to emerge as a prominent pest. Unfortunately, that often happens when we overplant something. Remember what I said at the beginning, diversity is key. We overplant the same thing over and over again, you can cause problems. All right, I will leave it at that. The ground layer is interesting. The best thing to do, don't treat weeds in your grass. You'll get a lot of cool species like blue-eyed grass, and of course like lyre-leaf sage, and of course like other species. Lots of cool ones, just don't treat weeds in your grass. You'd be surprised what pops up. Outside of that, I will cede my time because I can keep going for, again, I can keep going for hours. Thank y'all.
We're going to hold off on questions because we are going to go out for a few minutes and do a little site walk. And so Chris is going to go over a few things to look at that he has already presented on, but that way you can get like a real feel for what he's speaking about. And then if you have any questions, we can save them for the end. Thank you. So we'll just meet right outside here on the side doors.